All right, so welcome to all of you. Welcome to Kate Klancy, Matt Waskiewicz, and Megan Larmer and Sarah Salem. Each of you have different points on the regional food system compass, which is why it's going to be very interesting to hear from you. We have here perspectives from national and regional, big picture scales, from rural perspectives, urban perspectives. And as we know, this is a course on the private sector and food and farm policy. So we're interested in how the opportunities that and challenges that are present now, and it really is a question of what's now, what is important at this moment. So the question for you all is, how do you see those most significant opportunities for scaling up regional food systems with the assistance of public policy and programs at different levels? And by opportunities, I'm talking about meeting the gaps, barriers, in particular, and challenges with solutions that benefit urban and rural communities both, and businesses in farm and food economies across the spectrum, from small to medium and larger enterprises. So it's a big, that's a big bucket, right? So if you can just spend a minute describing your own work, where you work, and what's most important to you now, then 5 or 6 minutes each on that question, and then hopefully we'll have enough time to have responses to each other before we close. So why don't we start with you, Kate? You've been working for years on regional food systems, and I have come out with a wonderful report that the executive summary is required reading for this class that you're speaking to.
Well, yes, it's probably been 4 decades at least, Thomas, that Kathy Ruth, my colleague, friend, and co-conspirator on regional, and I have been working together on this. The report came out in September, and the timing was great because the USDA regional food business centers proposals came out right after that, and so people have been able to use the report. But I've actually been thinking about scale for a really long time. I think since I was an undergraduate, the notion of different scales has been really important to me. And I think I'm going to do a bigger picture. Everything I'm going to say relates to the private sector, but it also relates to all the other actors in food systems, wherever they are, in terms of the kinds of things that I think we need to be thinking about from the get-go. One of the major issues that Kathy and I saw very much as we did the report over 4 years and long before that is that actors have to understand why the regional scale is important. That means they have to understand why scale is important, why different scales have to work together that are nested inside each other. So the first thing is, the private sector may be a little bit ahead of other people in not making the mistake of conflating local and regional. They're not at all the same. Many people still conflate them. They use the same words for either scale. Local is only one of necessary scales in having a resilient food system. Resilience really is the long-term goal as we see it. Resilience is not a term that lots of people use yet regarding food systems, more in the agricultural sector maybe. And certainly climate change is driving much of the concern across all sectors of supply chains and the rest of the food system. So resilience seems to me to be the preeminent goal. And it needs to include the notion of scale and different scales. It's important that regional get a lot more attention. It's finally getting more attention, but it took decades literally before people started to see the concerns that arise when you don't pay attention to mid-scale, the mid-scale in terms of food systems, the mid-scale in terms of farms, the mid-scale in terms of other things. So how to understand, there is a pretty weak sense of regional identities in most cases. That needs to be addressed. More research needs to be done. People have to figure out how to make a regional identity more important. We have to look at, when you look at urban and rural dialogue, Thomas, which you are suggesting, which a lot of people are trying to build, it's very tricky. It requires probably a lot more early thinking through kind of critical analyses. I'm thinking of the work that Becca Jablonski and other people did in Colorado in trying to build really strong urban-rural conversations a couple of years ago. They had a really tough time. There wasn't agreement between the farmers and the urban people in Denver and other places in Colorado about whether they could work together or not. So that's something there. We have to be aware that regional is the scale that offers good solutions, or at least partial solutions, to climate change, to economic development, to land, water, and energy crises, and to public health. And finally, the flow right now of regional supply chains is not well organized. This is work that Michelle Miller has been doing for a number of years out in Wisconsin, but not just looking at the upper Midwest. So there needs to be a lot of work there. And finally, I will say, governance is really critical. And Thomas, you and Arthur have written about this. Other people have written about it. Obviously, people here are in governance positions, some of you, but every scale has to be savvy and has to be committed to a regional scale. And that's not the case. That savviness and commitment has not been built very strongly yet in most regions around the country. So I'll finish there.
Thank you, Kate. I had to unmute myself because I didn't want to have my typing be so loud. Thank you. That was fantastic overview. And I'm really glad you brought in the synergy of solutions across the non-food important priority areas: climate, energy, water, health. That was excellent. So building on that, can we turn to the Hudson Valley perspective, Sarah, that you have with the Food System Coalition work there? And I know that Hudson Valley is a very important and also unique microcosm of the larger region. It's also a very important region for city and the small and medium scale producers. And there's been work done on the issues around supply chain improvements that are unique in some ways to Hudson Valley. So could you give us a sense of your work on these issues, Sarah?
Sure. And thanks for having me here today with y'all. It's great to hear from everyone on the call, and thank you for inviting me, Thomas. Right. So I am a co-founder and facilitator of the Hudson Valley Food System Coalition that was founded in 2019, so right before the pandemic, in order to create a space for cross-sector collaboration in the food system, specifically here in the Hudson Valley. So we consider ourselves a cohort that involves partners in the food system that exist in that 8-county Hudson Valley region, which is kind of nestled in like the little panhandle of New York, if you will. And right, so we're connected by, the Hudson River, a lot of partners in the Hudson Valley, a lot of the urban cities share similar histories of industrial boom and then bust. And so a lot of that economy connects to our rural communities. And in the coalition, what we try and do is make those connections clear. And what we found prior to establishing the coalition was that there was no avenue to communicate between partners that exist both in the urban communities and the rural communities in the Hudson Valley, or even communicate with partners that exist outside of the Hudson Valley, because as we know, and as Kate demonstrates how, regionality impacts the work of food systems transformation, we can't just keep our work confined to our 8-county region in the Hudson Valley. We have to interact with New York City. We have to interact with the different, Capital District, Adirondack District, Schoharie, Finger Lakes, all over the state of New York and even beyond. So a lot of the work of what the coalition is involved in now is, yes, tackling food systems transformation specifically as it relates to the Hudson Valley, but also ensuring our work is communicating with other parts of the state and other parts of the Northeast region and the country in a whole, as a whole. So a lot of the work that we're engaged with now is in our community of practice work through the USDA, which is a national scope project to create best practices as to how regional food systems transformations are successful and how they can incorporate food system policy transformation. And, what I've been thinking about a lot, and you posed the question to us, how the private sector players in food systems can successfully transform the regional food system. And I think in addition to scale, it's really, really important to think about scope and, economies of scope when we're talking about food systems. And that is in the diversity of players, the diversity of, the labor force, diversity of the educators, diversity of the availability of food and what kind of food is being produced and grown and what kind of support we can lend to that effort. And when we're crafting local policy. And in addition to that is how we can then play on our scale with that scope in ensuring a cohesiveness of our policy practices across the region. And that's one of our primary drivers in the coalition right now, is to ensure we're, coordinating with players who are working on specific policies that can impact our local economy as it relates to food. And, I'm a big advocate for, food availability as being one of the ways that we can really tackle the issue of food insecurity across the board. And when we say food availability, thinking on how we can incorporate more regional foods in the private sector food system. And then additionally, I want to mention too, we talk a lot about root causes. It always comes back to the root cause. So while we work in food systems, we really work in, ensuring that the social inequities that exist in our communities, we find an avenue through our food system work to help to address those. So lack of affordable housing, land access, livable wages, lack of access to healthcare, and how that impacts people's bottom lines more. We're finding more and more now, even through the pandemic, how those disparities impact people's quality of life. And so with that, how we can ensure availability of regional foods across the board throughout the private sector, institution and stakeholder organizations. But right, so again, I just want to mention, growth and diversity or scope over the growth of, volume.
Very, very interesting. I think you really expanded on some of Kate's points around regional identity and the entry points for food systems work that also are contextual and differ from even within New York State and of course in the Northeast region. And that's so important to start dialogues with those outside of the strong advocates are converted to food systems thinking or food systems practice, right? So your work with the Hudson Valley Food System Coalition is really a wonderful platform of information exchange. And I know you're working on Farm Bill priorities, among other things now too. And so it would be really great to hear next, I think, from Megan, from a nonprofit organization that's part of that regional work at the Food Systems Coalition platform level, but also doing some because you also spoke to a level of concrete support, service, and actions to not only businesses, but the markets they work in and the consumer base that exists in different market channels, not only the emergency but also, of course, restaurant, farm to table, CSA are the smaller scale, but the scaling up that is now important. And so can I turn to you, Megan, and ask you to give us your perspective?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me here, Thomas. It's just a lovely group of people and glad for the opportunity to share some of our different perspectives. So as you mentioned, I work at the Glynwood Center for Regional Food and Farming. I'm the Senior Director of Regional Food Programs there. And the work we do all focuses on building a more equitable, resilient, ecologically sound food system for the region of the Hudson Valley. And we do that in a few different ways. We operate a farm that serves as a training center for livestock and vegetable production with regenerative and humane practices. My colleagues in farmer training help to run a small business incubator for different farm enterprises, as well as an apprenticeship across the Hudson Valley. And then in regional food programs, most of our work takes the form of community organizing, coalition building type projects. So those have resulted in work with the apple growing and hard cider sector, CSA farms, grain growers, bakers, restaurateurs, emergency food providers, a whole slew of folks, always with a real grounding in the need for a thriving and diverse agricultural community for our food systems to work. So yeah, I'd love to talk about some specifics, but I think where I want to start is with this question of scale that Kate brought, and which I've really admired in her research, acknowledging that region can mean a different thing depending on what it is you're looking at to foster or to work with, right? So I think of it, for example, the region for wheat that we would need to feed our food system in the Hudson Valley versus the region for, let's say, lettuces can be very different, right? When you think about the way things move through markets. So I also, the way I want to think about it is, you mentioned this idea of scaling up, that we need to scale up, right? And I actually want to push back against that a little bit and touch a little bit on what Sarah Salem was saying also, that in the work we do here at Glynwood, we are very grounded in direct stakeholder engagement. So the belief is that if there's a problem, the person closest to the problem is going to have the best solution, not necessarily the person who has been, thinking about it from a distance. So we really try to work with frontline practitioners, whether that be farmers or pantry managers or chefs themselves, to define where the intervention point will be most useful. And it might be worth noting that I'm trained as an anthropologist, so it will come as no surprise to hear that I think those systems and those solutions, critical to their resilience is that they be really grounded in a social network and in a social community. So I take a lot of inspiration for our work from emergent strategy as theorized by Adrienne Marie Brown, and looking to natural systems for the ways in which the reproduction or the production is fractal. It is, and I think what we need is more networked, more small scale to medium scale with purposeful redundancies in the system, whether we're talking about growing food, distributing food, or any of the other different factors that come into the private sector in food systems, right? Because one of the big lessons I think we all got from the pandemic was that the consolidation of our food system as both a business model and a policy priority is not a resilient model for us to continue to build on. So looking at these ways that we can overlap with intention and that we can really work close to the producers themselves. And to give a little, I know you wanted a tangible example, so I can talk to our Hudson Valley CSA Coalition, which was founded in 2017, has about 120 farm members across the Hudson Valley region, very specifically focused on the CSA model as critical to entrant farmers who are trying to start a business with very little startup capital, as well as, there's wonderful research by Dr. Tim Woods out of Kentucky about the different health benefits and lifestyle benefits for both CSA farmers and CSA members. It's really fascinating alternative economic system in ways, a mutual economic system. And so we just had our summit for that a couple of weeks ago in Kingston, brought together about 50 farmers or farm supporters or CSA technical assistance providers. And that entire day of programming was done as peer learning circles where we invited the farmers themselves to see themselves and view themselves as experts in the work, as business owners, and as people who were setting policies for how our food system should move. And so that is the kind of work that we try to get up to. Coming out of that coalition, we've had a number of different promotional campaigns, consumer research, as well as an initiative called CSA as a SNAP that attempts to make CSA more accessible to people using SNAP dollars for food procurement. So I think I might stop there, but yeah,
Okay.
happy to talk more.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm really glad that you expanded on what Sarah was saying about the growth and diversity of scope, not only volume and the specifics around inclusion. I don't know emergent strategy. I'm interested in looking at that. And by the way, as you and others suggest what's inspiring and important for your framing, your own building narratives that are about bringing people from different scales, different and diverse entry points together, it would be very helpful to send those or pop them into chat. I'm happy to see that. And when we do the recording, the chat function does, I'm not looking at it now because I'm taking notes on my small screen, but you're welcome to load anything up in the chat. So this has been fantastic. We're really getting a very well-rounded set of perspectives. And now let me turn to you, Matt. I know that you have been working for a few years within New York City Department of Planning. I know you also spent time at Cardiff in Wales, and you're familiar with some of the international discourse, which is very similar, although some of the language is different. But it would be very interesting to hear your take now that we are almost 2 years from the launch of the 10-year Food Forward plan, which is hard to believe it's been that long. But and you're now taking, you've had a role in convening the Regional Food Working Group, which I find so exciting to have a city-sponsored space for conversations, exchange of information, updates. I personally think it should go from there to other places as well, and the thinking that we've shared on that. But I'm interested in your perspective on what you feel is important now, maybe with a little bit more background than I just gave.
Sure, happy to, Thomas, and thank you for having me. And I'm thrilled to be on this panel with our other guests. My name is Matt Waskiewicz. I am a senior planner in the New York City Department of City Planning, but my role is to think about economic development both within New York City's 5 boroughs, but across our greater region. And I will say, as it relates to food systems or any of our work, we don't have a single definition of what we mean when we say the region. It really depends on what you're thinking about in your analysis or in your engagement. So, for example, the Census Bureau has a definition of New York City's metropolitan area, and even they use multiple scales when they talk about the region. They have a metropolitan statistical area, and then they have a combined statistical area that includes areas as far away as the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania. For our work, we try to think in practical senses of both commuting in a pre-pandemic sense. So we define our region for jobs and for economic development as being the 31 county tri-state area that basically stretches from New Haven down to Trenton, New Jersey, includes all of Long Island and the Hudson Valley up to Poughkeepsie. So you can think of a shorthand as being, what is the stretch of our regional rail system? That's essentially what we encompass to be our region. For food, we think of it much more differently. So, and there are multiple scales even within that. So New York City, of course, due to its size and to its scale, sources its food globally and on an industrial scale. And within that, though, we think about the practical boundaries of our regional food system as being roughly a day's drive. So that could be everything from Western New York near the Finger Lakes region up to most of New England and down to Maryland and Virginia even. And depending on the type of year, you will see products that appear in supermarkets and in farmers markets in New York City that kind of stretch from that boundary. But for the purpose of some of the work that we do for engaging with other folks, we typically include four main states, these being New York State, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. We also, in some of the work that we do, engage with New England, particularly folks from Massachusetts and Vermont. The work that New York City has done in regional food systems has grown over the last few years, really started prior to the pandemic, but as a result of the initial months and disruption to our food system coming in March and April and May of 2020, there was a clear need to have better connections with both public and private actors in our region food system. So out of a necessity, I and some colleagues started what we called a quad state call, which was featuring departments of agriculture from the 4 states I mentioned, and gradually grew into a now semi-formalized New York City Regional Food Working Group. And I emphasize the semi-informal nature because we think that it's a benefit that we have an open tent. Anyone who is interested in joining us can. And we meet a few times a year on a subset of topics that we decide together. So we as the city co-chair and convene a group, but we by no means try and dictate the agenda or even the items that are discussed. We try to make it an open forum where folks who are from different governments across the broader region, but also academic actors, people in the private sector, can come together and talk about shared issues and challenges and opportunities. And so we feel that part of our role for expanding the opportunities for food systems thinking comes from introducing folks who don't work in food systems day in, day out. So a large part of the work that we do in our regional food working groups, including planning and economic development and government professionals who don't work in food, but whose day-to-day job may touch upon needs for our region's food system. So one clear example of that is planning professionals who are thinking about infrastructure investments and how infrastructure investments can be used to support small farms and food system entrepreneurs across our broader region. So that's a bit about some of the work that we do and how we think about regional food systems. Now I'll touch on a little bit more, since you brought it up, Thomas, about how at least my personal thinking has evolved in the 2 years since New York City introduced its 10-year food plan. I'll note that this was, I think, the first time New York City had formalized a regional thinking for the future of its food supply, and thought about the region through a sense of resiliency and economic equity, but also sustainability, and how these concentric circles of thinking can help create a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient food system for all New Yorkers, but for our broader region. We came out and released this plan. It was developed during the first part of the pandemic in 2020. It was finalized and released in February of 2021. And now we're starting the process of revisiting some of the recommendations that came out of the plan. But one of them that has continued to stand out to me is how small amounts of public support can go a long way in supporting those who are in the private and nonprofit sectors to advance the work that they wish to do. So for example, coming into the pandemic in 2020, you saw a large number of mutual aid organizations pop up in different parts of New York City, and they were responding to a massive unmet need for food and people who were food insecure and were in need of food. And so what started as an emergency feeding operation quickly started to pivot towards supporting entrepreneurial activity for folks in New York City, whether they were urban farmers or people who had a food product idea, and started to scale up from there. And so as city government, we looked at a lot of these informal organizations and tried to think about what are ways that we can provide small grants or other types of ways that we can frankly just get government regulation out of the way to help a lot of these organizations be able to stand on their own and continue to do what they do. So we conducted a series of research with Department of City Planning and the New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy, where we focused on 3 particular neighborhoods of New York City throughout 2021 and tried to understand as much as we could where public sector interventions could come in some cases, provide $5,000 or $10,000 to a community garden so that they could have power generation in a solar panel, or have raised beds, or have a greenhouse so they can grow for a couple more months out of the year and support some of the ongoing work. So the way that we're connecting this to regional food systems is trying to understand how a lot of the work that happens within the city is connected to what comes outside of it. And knowing that we are part of that broader ecosystem, we're continuing to think about what are ways that New York City government can lend either its data capacity, its convening capacity, its other types of, whether it's the role of public procurement and the way that we have purchasing power. What is our role within the broader regional ecosystem, and how can we foster some of the connections that my colleagues on this call have been talking about? How can we create the investments that we need to support regionalism and regional food systems in the context of an industrial and global food system that for so long continues to be exploitive in its very nature? So how do we continue to move in that direction as a city government? How do we continue to use the tools that we have to imbue our values into what we see as the future of the food system? I'll stop there because I know we've got lots more to go to, but happy to be here.
Fantastic, wonderful. And I want to hear how others have reflected on your own presentations, give another round to respond. But let me just go right to what Kate said about regional identity being weak. I thought that was a very important. I'm working right now with some very strong regional actors outside of the US that make me green with envy, because there's a huge gap in the US of authority at a regional, which for us would be multi-county at least, if not multi-state. And there are regional bodies, but the food systems issues are not strong in any but a few of those. And so I'm very glad there's this community of practice assembled from FPCs starting up. And I know there are other things, the regional food business centers. I don't know if there's any announcement out yet, but anyway, I've been following that since it was first an idea. And all of this because I think the strength of regional identity is so important, and yet it is also, as you said, Kate, tricky and needs thinking through. So where are the spaces where that thinking through, and Matt, you just talked about the thinking that is not only your own, but also internal to MOFP, a small team that is actually very imbued with the lessons of the pandemic and other economic development challenges, the food emergency, rethinking the emergency food program, operationalizing the good food procurement efforts. These are huge, huge, complex tasks. And I think the regional thinking that Kate, you first talked about, and that was deepened, I think, by both Sarah and Megan, I'm very interested in the spaces where these can happen and include the private sector and the civil society or nonprofit sector. And I'm wondering if that's something that anyone else has a reflection on. I mean, the platform in the Hudson Valley Food Coalition is also effectively an informal think tank on its own with policy and exchange of information. And I don't think we need a formal think tank. And I like the informality of the regional food working group the city has stood up. But what are the other critical spaces that we need? And of course, this is my own thinking now, and I've shared some of this on paper with Megan and Sarah, and I think with Matt, and I'm happy to. I don't know if I did with Kate, but anyway, let's hear from you and what stimulated you from each other's points. And we only have a few minutes before we need to close. So anyone want to take a first run at response or additional points you'd like to make?
We mentioned, I just want to quickly mention that we talk in the report about a number of possibilities. Some of them are obvious. Wherever there is a cog, there should be more pressure being put on cogs, and they're all over the country, to enter into this discussion about regional food. I know from experience in the DC area that it's not easy, and the pandemic threw a lot of regional discussions out of the room because there was so much that needed to be done right away. But cogs are one place. I think that in terms of what we looked at, for example, independent grocery stores, where their National Professional Association is getting much stronger, they're really putting a lot of effort into it, are interested in regional notions. So there's another place to think about working. There is this notion, Thomas, you know everything about this, and we talk about it a lot in the report, our city regions. They seem to be, they are out there, they're functioning. As I go really deep into their websites, it's not clear what they're accomplishing yet in a lot of places around the world. But we do have the Milan-packed cities, and New York is one of them. But it seems to me that that's another place, another coat hanger, or a place to think about how do we approach these folks who are already thinking this way to move more into the food space.
4 really good suggestions there. Thanks. Anybody else?
I just, I think those suggestions were great. And I also want to mention, some of what we've been engaged with recently too, through the Food System Coalition is food system kind of foresight, future planning, to prepare for different scenarios that do expose, the blind spots or, the areas where we need to disrupt and cause intervention in the food system, but also from a perspective to offer different pathways to the solutions. And then, lend spaces to come up with those kinds of solutions that invite different parts of the community in. And so one of the things I want to say, as where are the spaces for these kinds of, changes, where do those occur? I would say one space that I think, and I know it happens more often in larger cities, but in smaller cities, in city council chambers, we don't have enough discussion on food systems change. And we need to have more discussion on food systems policies, at scale in smaller cities across the country. And especially in New York State, in the Hudson Valley, I don't hear in any city council chambers any talk about food systems. There may be talk here and there about, planning community gardens, but not how that relates to the larger community, and how that relates to food system functioning, and sustainability or regeneration or, vibrancy and vitality in the economy, when, a lot of jobs in the community are food systems jobs. And, we need to kind of make those relations. And I think we can do that if we kind of take the approach of, futures planning, and exploring different ways we can reach the scenarios that we want to see, and involve the community in that discussion as well. And there, I think, lies part of the solution.
That's great. That's really great.
Completely agree with both Sarah and Kate, and I would just add that, at least from my perspective in government, Kate's exactly right, that so much of the work that can be done in the future is from government entities that are above the municipal level, that are doing a lot of regional work already, but may not be thinking about it through a food systems lens. So this includes counties that may think about supporting farms, and they may think about emergency feeding and food kitchens, but not in between. And so it's there's a lot in the literature about the missing middle infrastructure that's needed, and the role that counties, councils of government, municipal planning organizations, and many states can and should play in supporting that middle infrastructure. And I'm talking both about the hard infrastructure of things like shared commercial kitchen spaces and food hubs and processing infrastructure and grants that farms need, increasingly electrification and ways to transport food, but also the soft infrastructure of the organizations that sometimes just need a little bit of grant money to get someone part-time or full-time to do the organizational work that's necessary to make these connections. And so the role that cities can play is in advocating for that as well, and making sure that there is proper funding from a public sector perspective to support a lot of this private and value-based work.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Yeah, Megan, do you want to add anything before we round
Sure.
out?
I mean, I absolutely agree with it, with what everyone is saying, especially around the idea of investing in the middle between the farm and the consumer, looking at incentivizing certain farmland practices, incentivizing small businesses to engage with regional and local food production. I think that's really been left out. You know, the farm to table restaurant movement has been great for raising visibility, but the greenwashing that we see in that business place now is a lot, and I can understand why. From a restaurateur's perspective, they have no incentive other than the highest priced plate to actually be sourcing, no economic incentive, I should say, to be sourcing from regional farms. And I think there is a role there to play for governance to give them some incentive to do so beyond just to the consumer. So yeah, distribution, absolutely agree with Matt about the need for value chain coordination and resourcing the people who do that. And I do think there is a lot of small business opportunity for diversification in the agricultural sector and specialization, because at the moment, many of the farms we work with, for example, the CSA Coalition, the majority of farms are operating on less than 10 acres. And they're doing everything, right? They're doing wholesale and CSA and retail, and they're distributing all of it. And it's driving people out of the sector, frankly. It's driving people out of the profession to do all of that. So I think there are really important roles for regional coordination to take some of that burden off of people who want to farm or who want to run restaurants, and let them do those things and create the business opportunities and nonprofit sector opportunities to do other things. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. You know, I'm aware of the time and the fact that Matt especially has to leave in about 6 minutes. So can I just stop here to thank you profoundly for this conversation? It's really been fantastic. There's a lot of threads to follow, and there's a fabric that those threads have woven just in 40 or so minutes of conversation. So I'm very excited to present this to students. I also want to invite you back if you're interested. Wednesday, I can share, like I did yesterday, one of 3 guests did come back, a wonderful longtime organizer for farm labor at the international level, and we had a great conversation with the class. So if anyone wants to, I will share a Zoom link, or if someone does want to, and you can jump into a discussion of this topic and various things that we've covered. So let me thank you again, and I will go ahead and stop here. And here it goes. Thanks.